Good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar on the Appalachian Foodshed Project's Western North Carolina Community Food Security Assessment. We're going to go ahead and get started. Today we have with us John Eshelman, who's a postdoctoral research associate at NC State University, and he's been a part of the project working to pull together this assessment in Western North Carolina. So we're very excited to have him with us and sharing the results of this assessment. If you've come to some of our webinars in the past, you may know a little bit about our project, but just in case, we are a three-state project in Appalachia. We work in Western North Carolina, Southwest Virginia, and the whole state of West Virginia. And we're funded by USDA AFRI grant. And this is wrapping up some of our final pieces under this funding. We've done assessments across the three states. If you missed our report and webinar on the Appalachian Virginia Food Security Assessment, you can find recordings of that on our website at www.appalachianfoodshedproject.org. You can also find ways to link up to future webinars. We are having another webinar on our West Virginia assessment process on May 4th at 2 p.m., so please join us for that. That's the third part in this installment. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to John for the presentation. We will have a time for questions and answers and discussion after his presentation. You can either participate via your microphone or phone, or you can type into the chat box and I'll help read questions to him so he can answer some of your questions. Without further ado, thank you so much, John.
Thank you, Nikki, and thanks to AFP for hosting as we talk about our work in Western North Carolina as part of the Appalachian Foodshed Project. So today I'm going to present a series of findings from the project that focuses on barriers and opportunities to food security in Western North Carolina. What I put on the screen here is a map that lays out incidents of food security, the food insecurity rate in Western North Carolina across the 27 counties. So over 16% of people in Western North Carolina are food insecure. So that's a rate about 2% higher than the national average. So for some context, that's about 220,000 people in the region who lack access to healthy food with some regularity and do not know where the next, or may not know where the next meal is coming from. So I've put a definition of community food security up on the screen, which should look familiar for many of you. So drawing from some of the work by Mark Ham and Bellows, I've put, I think a lot of us are familiar with what community food security is and how it compares to an anti-hunger approach. So the anti-hunger approach, more focused at the individual level and shorter term time frame, drawing from emergency food and federal aid, focused on more commodity and low food price compared to community food security, which takes that community scale, is a longer term time frame, with an emphasis on local food and local agriculture and market-based relationships. In many ways, though, I think that this comparison is largely theoretical. In a practical way, I would suggest that both anti-hunger and community food security approaches are both important. It's not an either-or proposition. So there's a long-term goal to have community food security such that that emergency food system isn't necessary, but in the immediate term, there's a need to alleviate suffering in these communities. So I think a key question guiding this work has been, how can we support that long-term vision while still meeting the short-term need for healthy food access for all? Nikki mentioned the Appalachian Foodshed Project, and many of you on the call are probably familiar. I put, the overall goal of the project was to improve healthy food access, expand food security, enhance the food economy. It's been a collaboration between multiple universities, researchers, students, community stakeholders in West Virginia, Virginia, and Western North Carolina. I think a key thing to add here is that in each of these three states, we developed our own community food security assessments. So Nikki mentioned, the West Virginia one is coming up at a webinar on May 4th, and you can access the Virginia one that was given last week. So I'll talk a little bit about how we went about this process here in Western North Carolina. So several years ago, we assembled a group of organizations and stakeholders from the region working across the food system, and that became the Western North Carolina Food Security Advisory Committee. It's this group that is based in Western North Carolina and works in Western North Carolina to improve the food system, and they helped guide the project. Early on, the group identified its goal is to increase bridging and bonding of food system networks. So there's already work going on to improve the food system and to work on food security in Western North Carolina, but this committee really came together wanting to see better connections and more bridging and more bonding of those networks. And our primary task throughout has been to develop this community food security assessment. So I've now mentioned that term several times, and really the purpose of the community food security assessment is to establish the scope of the problem and to do so within a community context. So to try to figure out what is going on and then begin to figure out what we might be able to do about it. So the process has included identifying barriers, assets, and opportunities in Western North Carolina on this issue, and then also to clarify some key questions and next steps so communities for communities to consider, and then they can work toward change. So I think that last one is really important. We heard throughout the process the idea of universities coming into a project and creating a report and saying, here's what you need to do, and that for these community groups, that really doesn't work, that those recommendations end up on a shelf. So instead, the idea here was to work closely with community stakeholders through this advisory committee and to get some baseline understanding so those community partners can then work towards changes. So for our community food security assessment, there were two primary components to this. So the first was quantitative. We developed a series of indicators to assess the current status and trends of the food on a range of food system topics, which I've listed here. And we've done that across the 27 Western North Carolina counties. But in addition, and mostly what I'll talk about today, was a qualitative component. So the idea here was to provide a more in-depth narrative and an on-the-ground assessment of food security in several communities. So that included 24 interviews with practitioners who work on food security in some capacity to gain their perspective on the problem. We also conducted 5 focus groups with resource-limited community members about their priorities, values, and decision-making around food and food topics. So this portion, this qualitative component, we focused on 3 different counties: Buncombe County, which is where Asheville is located, and also Mitchell and Yancey County are 2 rural counties. So the idea is that by focusing on these 3 counties, we get a more in-depth case study view, but it's intended to be applicable to other communities in the region. And the findings I'll present today are largely drawing from these practitioner interviews and the focus groups both. So I put a screenshot up here on the screen from the Western North Carolina Vitality Index. I don't have time to really cover all of the quantitative section of our work today, but we partnered with UNC Asheville's National Environmental Modeling and Analysis Center, or NEMAC, that they gather data on all sorts of indicators and maps in Western North Carolina, and all sorts of indicators in Western North Carolina, and create maps and some neat tools to convey that information. So I put the link up here if you want to check some of that out, and I'll also put a link at the end to get a full version of our report, which includes this quantitative piece. So I mentioned barriers and opportunities in the intro to the CFSA for Western North Carolina, and barriers are particularly important, I think, for understanding food security in this community context. So I'm going to discuss a few of the barriers that stood out for us in this research, and then discuss some opportunities that emerge from the work. And I'll conclude with some beginning recommendations. So 7 different barriers came through in the interviews and the focus groups, and I've listed them each here. Many of these overlap, but I'd say each is distinct, and as you can see from the labels, they range from more specific tangible items like transportation to more broad societal scale barriers. In the interest of time, I'm really going to focus on 5 of these because I think they raise important, challenging questions for communities to think through. So for each of these 5 barriers, I'll present some key quotes from our qualitative interviews and focus groups for each barrier, and then pose some key questions for communities to consider as they work to alleviate food security. So I'm going to start with at the top with systemic poverty. We know that there's a clear relationship between food security and poverty, and this was a key point that came through our interviews. You can't really talk about barriers to food security and healthy food access without also talking about systemic poverty. So I put a quote up here on the screen, this idea of continuing need, and that what some of these practitioners have observed is a kind of routinely families and households coming up short at the end of the month. I think part of the challenge is the chronic nature of poverty. We think of emergency and the term emergency and emergency food systems as temporary, but as cited in the literature, and we see here, for many, food insecurity is a daily and ongoing challenge, and there's a certain reliance that's created on assistance programs. So there was, a clear understanding through the interviews, particularly people that operated food pantries and some of these emergency services, that the model was really only treating part of the problem. It was stopping the crisis, or the term Band-Aid was used. So there's some awareness to that, but really what to do about it is a challenge. So I think some key questions here are, how do we create and support food security models that emphasize independence when people are relying on emergency food assistance in a regular way? And in working toward that more resilient food system based on self-reliance, what kind of role does the emergency food system have in that, or is there a role to play there? Second, related to poverty is the idea of healthy food affordability. We asked this question directly in both interviews and focus groups. Is healthy food affordable? And we got complicated answers. So on one hand, no, the healthy food was not considered affordable. And I've put a couple of the key quotes up here. In the second quote, particularly, among some of the low-income or low-wealth community members we talked to, we asked about farmers markets, and they just felt like it was out of their reach. So based on these responses, I think of healthy food affordability as a key barrier. But on the other hand, for many of the interviewees, it wasn't that healthy food wasn't affordable, it was more a matter of perception. And this kind of feeds into the idea of knowledge gaps, which I'll talk about in a little bit. In addition, non-market channels were discussed as a key piece to the affordability question. So even though healthy food isn't affordable through emergency food systems, community members, noted that they could find healthy food through those systems and other non-market channels. Community gardens came up on several occasions. It worked for certain people because it was a trade on time. So these are still resources. They still require effort, but it's a different kind of resource. So I think the key question here then is, how can communities expand opportunities for and improve access to healthy food options through both non-market and market channels? Insufficiency of the subsidized food programs and assistance. So those of you familiar with Pop and Dink's Sweet Charity will recognize that word, insufficiency. As I noted in the poverty section, the system isn't set up for chronic need. So that's one clear insufficiency. But in addition to that, we had reports and had through our interviews learned that there were other insufficiencies that came through. Particularly there was ideas around meat protein was a big one, and other sorts of fresh produce and fresh items. In this case, and in several other cases, refrigeration was a key barrier. So, these are volunteer-run programs often, and they operate on low budgets. So there were certain resource limitations that they experienced that impacted their ability to offer sufficient healthy food. Not listed here, but in addition, I would add that in cases where EBT machines weren't available at farmers markets, that can kind of hint at some insufficiency. Also, in particular, we did one of our focus groups with the Hispanic community, and they found that the cultural appropriateness of the food through the emergency food system was a barrier. But as I said, in many cases, this insufficiency relates to organizational capacity. That volunteer-run organizations were challenged to source the demanded quantity and specific items that they felt were in demand from their clients. So a key question, I think, is are there resources in community to enable food providers to more consistently offer healthy foods, particularly fresh fruit items? So cultural barriers could capture a lot of different things, but here I'm going to focus on two specific ways that cultural barriers came up in the research, and both relate to the community food security goals of connecting local food systems to address food security. So the first is mostly around farmers markets. The idea that some farmers market shoppers were made to feel unwelcomed, and this practitioner notes that it's a really great step that a lot of farmers markets, particularly in Asheville, are able to accept EBT, but there's more subtle issues here, and so this has many class implications. But as the second quote that I put up shows, it's also there's also a racial tone to it, and this was a particular community member that talked about, at first she thought it was about the fact that she was low income and was on EBT, but really felt that being Black created a certain barrier, and it affected her experience, and it created an unwelcoming shopping environment. So I think a key question to wrestle with is how do we create food environments that are welcoming and culturally appropriate for everyone in the community. Then a second type of cultural barrier is more about the kind of overall culture of alternative food movements or local food movement, and how food security fits into this. This interviewee, notices more of a focus on farmers having livable wages, and that for her is important. She believes that farmers should be getting paid well for the work that they do, and it's hard work, and we heard this on several occasions. But at the same time, based on the perceptions of and the reality of healthy food affordability, how can we then get that food to people in the community that really need it is a key question. So, some of you may have heard this described as the difference between food security and farm security. I just want to be clear, it's not a competition or an either-or question, and the ultimate aim of community food security is to serve both of these farm and food security needs, but I do think it's important to be transparent about possible tensions here. And then a fifth barrier, the final barrier I'll talk about today, was the most common one that came up in the interviews, particularly among the practitioners we talked to, and that was knowledge gaps. So for them, they emphasized the importance of educating people on what is healthy, how to shop for and cook healthy food, and particularly how to do all those things on a budget. So another thing that came up, it's not in this quote, was teaching people how to grow their own food as an important way to try to work in food security. However, in the focus groups, with low wealth community members, we didn't hear about education or knowledge gaps. You know, the level of understanding about healthy food and how to prepare healthy food was quite high. Instead, it was other factors were really the barriers that that they focused on. So it's not that I don't know how, it's that I'm tired and I work multiple jobs, I'm very busy. Kids is something that came up on several occasions. It's not that I don't know what healthy food is, it's just that I can't really afford it or I don't think I can afford it. So drawing from some of these other barriers as opposed to education. So I presented some difficult questions. So, you know, an additional part to this work was to try to identify some assets and some opportunities to work toward improving food security in Western North Carolina. So I'm going to work through some of those. So what I put up on the screen here is as a basic socio-ecological model. So the idea behind this model is to see that individuals are nested into larger environments and that those larger environments also affect their health and well-being. So when thinking about creating change on any particular issue, in this case food security, the idea is to look for opportunities at each of these levels. So I'm going to talk through each of these levels and some of the findings from the work, and then I'll conclude with a couple recommendations. So at the individual and interpersonal level is really that place, I think, for education. As I mentioned, how to shop for, prepare, and grow healthy food. So for practitioners, this was the most common answer to questions about what needs to be done to improve food security, was to educate. So several examples, you know, the FNEP program through Cooperative Extension. Bountiful Cities is a local nonprofit in Buncombe County that works with people to train them on community gardening. Farm to School would be an example of this we heard about in many cases. There are many others that focus on education. But some challenges, you know, capacity is a key challenge. You'll see that in each one of these opportunities that I lay out when I talk about challenges. But also enrollment, you know, in some cases we did hear, you know, some desire for education, but getting people to participate was a challenge. But that, and then in addition, when there's lower enrollment, it's hard to justify the expense of some of these programs. So there's been funding cuts on some of these types of programs. It also included cultural appropriateness, making sure that the education really meets the needs of the target population. At the institutional and organizational level, projects and programs were cited as a major asset and strength in Western North Carolina. There are many organizations focused on connecting resource-limited community members to healthy food. This was really communicated through the idea of getting healthy food to where people are. And it corresponds in many ways with an idea of convenience, not necessarily in a luxury way, but more that healthy food is available in the normal patterns of daily life. I think the corollary to this would be getting people to where healthy food is, which has a lot to do with transportation, which was one of the other barriers that came through that I didn't talk about today. There are some key programs aimed at this level, mobile markets, backpack programs that send children home with food through schools and through after-school programs, food pantries, and some others. So, you know, a similar challenge, capacity, is something that we heard over and over, that, you know, funding is tight to operate. You know, we heard, especially through some of the emergency food providers, a desire to do more and to do more than just give food out, but they just felt limited in what they could accomplish. And then cultural appropriateness again, but also challenges in supply. I mentioned meat protein as an issue. when I talked about insufficiency, so just having enough supply of fresh food and a supply of products like meat. And then also transportation can be a barrier, whether it's getting to supply sites or whether it's getting to educational programs, things along these lines. At the community level, collaboration between organizations was cited as a key element to improving food security in the region. So that came through in two different ways, this idea of collective impact, but also practitioners particularly describe the importance of community and economic development as a general framework and concept. So some of this is already happening. The Community Service Navigators program is through Health and Human Services in Buncombe County. They work with housing projects to do like a mobile market style thing. The Toe River Food Security Network is linking churches and congregations in Yancey and Mitchell counties to provide better services. There's a nascent new community garden network is another example. So, you know, the hope is that the AFP was able to add to some of this work. So as far as challenges go, capacity once again, and in a particular way, that these types of collaborations can be added on top of other programs, and that without additional funding and infrastructure to support them, it can be really taxing on the organizations that are involved. Power dynamics came through as something that was important, that because some of these organizations are resource limited, you know, there's competition for funds and competition for grants in ways that make it challenging to work together in some cases. And I added the word specificity here, and that's, you know, there's two ways that I feel like specificity was noted as a challenge. So one, you know, community economic development is great, and it was discussed as a key element to the community, but when pressed to talk about what that means specifically, or how does that, you know, how do we put that to action, there wasn't clear, specific ways that that our interviewees discussed how to go about that. And then the second piece to specificity is related to that collective impact, is, you know, the challenge of defining roles so collaboration is most effective without having too many cooks in the kitchen, to have specific projects and programs and collaborations set up that it's taking advantage of the diverse skill sets that different organizations have. And then finally, at the policy level, you know, the answer really here was not sure. You know, there was a large amount of energy around education and around programs and collaboration, but really little in terms of policy, be it at the local level or beyond. Now, that said, you know, there was mention of certain different policy projects that exist, and there was some knowledge that they exist, but what they do and how to be involved with them was a little less clear. So I've noted some here. There's several food policy councils in Western North Carolina. Yes, Youth Empowered Solutions is a program that works with youth through various programs to influence the food system. And then the NC Sustainable Local Food Advisory Council is a state level food policy network based out of NC State here in our STEPS program. So again, capacity is a challenge for each of these types of programs. I've also included funding to be a little bit more specific. You know, it's a challenge in some cases to get funding for grants that are aimed at policy. A lot of funders are really more targeted on projects and programs. Public engagement in policy is a significant challenge, be it through cynicism or patience. It's sometimes a challenge to engage public in policy matters, be it at local or larger levels. Some of that, I think, really has to do with the immensity, that trying to influence policy is an uphill climb. So particularly when we're discussing systemic challenges around food security, such as poverty and race and class and farm viability. It can be difficult to engage folks. So I've laid out several barriers and some opportunities. So I'm going to conclude with some general recommendations for how to improve, possibly how to improve food security in Western North Carolina. Whenever I give these, I like to be clear that these are really only useful when stakeholders support them and are invested in their outcomes. So that requires not only community input, which I feel like we've got in this project, but also strategic leadership and collaboration to kind of move the work forward. So first is to increase efforts that integrate advocates and practitioners into long-term and viable collaborative networks. Those networks ideally will honor diverse approaches and skills and experiences of the participants. These types of networks, though, they require some level of institutional support and infrastructure, I would say. Second is to inform practitioners of pertinent policy issues related to food security and provide training on ways to advocate at the local and other levels. We heard this some through the interviews, that I'm aware of certain policy efforts that are taking place, but I just don't know how to really get involved with that, or I'm not really trained in how to do that, and I'd like to be. Third is to really engage in open discussions and difficult discussions about how to approach race and class barriers at food venues, particularly farmers markets, other sites commonly associated with local food networks. We heard a lot about education, and I think it's important to continue to prioritize food-based education and outreach, particularly targeted in those key areas practitioners noted: food shopping, preparation, home food growing, but just so long as there's demand for those efforts and it's affirmed by community members. So education in food pantries is one approach that we might consider. And then fifth, the idea of getting healthy food to where people are. So increased efforts to expand key healthy food assistance programs. That would include mobile markets, backpack programs, community garden distribution models. Community garden specifically came through in the focus groups as something that was desirable, but through several barriers, rental property limitations, and those types of restrictions were a barrier. I also want to note the Community Service Navigators program again is through Health and Human Services in Buncombe County, where they're doing a mobile market type of program that works with a large food bank to bring healthy food and bring fresh food to the housing community, so people in that community don't have to go out to get it. And then finally, to continue, there's been a large amount of growth in the entire state of North Carolina. I don't have the numbers on just Western North Carolina on offering EBT at farmers markets, but there were still, especially in our rural counties we looked at, there were still several markets that didn't have them. So increasing that availability, and particularly to expand marketing and outreach efforts to promote those programs, and to really find creative ways, I would say in addition to this, to find creative ways to site farmers markets in areas of need that are more accessible to low-income community members. So, and I guess just to conclude, these are not easy recommendations or easy solutions, but that fits because food insecurity is a complex problem. So the hope is that through our community food security assessment, we can help communities in Western North Carolina not start this work, they've been doing this work, but to help to continue it and continue it in new ways. So that's it. And just I want to quickly note that at the bottom there underneath my name, it has AFP WNC Community Food Security Assessment. You can access our full report of all this work that I've just summarized through that link that's there if you're interested.
Thank you. so much, John. I think that was really informative. And before we open up for questions, that link, if you want to click on it, it's also in the chat box, so you can get instant access right now. Without further ado, if you have questions, you can unmute yourself and ask them out loud, or you are welcome to type into the chat box. So I'm going to turn it over to you all and see what questions or comments you might have on the assessment. And John, while we're waiting for people to form some of their questions, you presented this initially earlier in the winter or spring, depending on your perspective. Has there been any movement to take some of these recommendations forward, or is there a natural place for thinking about how some of these recommendations get implemented in the region? Is that conversation happening now in Western North Carolina?
Yes. So the project's ending, but I'm working with two of our community partners through the advisory committee to think about ways to kind of move the work forward or move on to a step 2. So, you know, I didn't talk about it, but, you know, a key challenge to a project like this and to any type of community-based participatory research, which is where I place some of this work, is that we're at NC State, so we're not in Western North Carolina, and so I think the first step for this, any future work that happens, and what I'm working with our community partners there, is looking for an institutional home or some level of institutional support, be it from another university or from a hospital or through some other way to base this work out in Western North Carolina a little bit more directly, or to have all the partners be in Western North Carolina. You know, in addition to, you know, so I think that's the main way. You know, I've received some interest and follow-up since we did, you know, what Nikki's mentioning is we held a wrap-up summit, is what we called it, that brought together food systems advocates throughout all of Western North Carolina for a day of to communicate some of our work, and we also partnered with a group that works on food policy councils to do that work. So, so yeah, we're also going to be having regional calls with people that attended that conference to talk about ways to keep moving the food system forward in a positive direction.
Thanks, John. Any other questions? Again, if you can access your chat box, you can see it below. If you can see the participants section on your screen, there's a chat section. You're welcome to type a question in, or again, use the audio function to ask one out loud. I'll keep asking you questions because I'm curious about the work with community food strategies that you were just mentioning. So has there been any kind of alignment with what is going on in the rest of the state in terms of your findings and even the conversations that are happening? I know they're working in different, all across the state. So how, is there any sense that there is commonality between the conversations and the work that's happening in Western North Carolina and the rest of the state?
That's a really good question, Nikki. I think that they're still doing their regional meetings, so I haven't checked in on how all of those have gone. You know, I think that the link and the connection is that community food strategies and what Nikki's talking about is a program through the Center for Environmental Farming Systems here at NC State, and they coordinate a statewide food policy council network. So there's a lot of energy around those types of networks, whether they're specifically focused on policy or not, throughout different regions of the state. And we see that energy through this research and through the summit that we had. But I think a key finding for us here was that there could be some possibilities to pursue, to think about how to incorporate food security as part of food policy councils. I think that was one of our main findings here. So it's a logical partnership to be working with steps on how to expand those networks and help those networks be sustainable, keeping them going and having them, there's a lot of excitement and energy around them, but the harsh realities of capacity and funding and things like that are a challenge. So
thanks, John, that helps. So there's a question from James Martin. What is the largest barrier that makes government community engagement difficult?
What is the largest barrier that makes? I don't know. I think that it's difficult. I think that it's hard to see results. And I think that, I'm shooting off the cuff here, but, there are other ways that people can support the food system and that I think are easier to support the food system through their purchasing practices and through supporting farmers in those types of ways. But, going up against local policymakers or state policymakers or federal policymakers is an immense challenge. So I think the sheer immensity and the incremental nature of it and the difficulty that comes from trying to enroll busy people in that process and figuring out how to have influence is a key challenge.
Thanks for that question, James. Any other questions, again, in the chat box, or go ahead and... So, John, if you can take away, what would be your one or two key takeaways that you would highlight? You have several recommendations at the end.
Good question. I think for me, the race and culture questions are really important to me. And, community food security is founded on principles of social justice, and it's uncomfortable and it's difficult to hear experiences that people of different classes and races don't always feel accepted within the food system. So I think that is one really important key takeaway. I think the other one is that the idea of community food security was really forged in the 1990s as a framework and as a concept, and we're pretty far removed from that, and there's an incredible amount of work that's already happening. So it's not like we did this project and there wasn't a lot in place. There's incredible assets in place. So figuring out ways to connect the dots and to bring organizations together and advocates together on these topics that serve a specific need. There already are certain networks, there are certain groups, so it's really important to figure out how to do that in a way that isn't adding too much work, that it can be sustained. But there's a lot of good stuff that's there already.
Thanks, John. We had another question from James, and he was asking, he said, do those problems make a top-to-bottom approach to systemic solutions unviable? Mm-hmm. May need some clarification on what, which problems you were asking about. I assume by top-to-bottom approach, we're talking about policy implementation. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, Yeah, I think that in many cases, the top-down approach isn't really going to work. I mean, you know, a lot of, especially at the local level, you know, there are competing needs, and there could be, you know, there are certain counterexamples, but where I think there's been success in food policy at the local level, it's come through grassroots efforts and through some of the work that food policy councils have done on land use and zoning issues, and in addition to those specific policy networks, other types of programs and organizations that exist. The Fresh Fruit Financing Initiative comes to mind as one of them in the Philadelphia area. So yeah, I think that top-down, you know, I think the grassroots is part of is the key there. I don't know if I answered the question or not.
Yeah, James clarified. He said, do the mentioned issues make a federal or state government solution too difficult to affect communities or individuals?
Can you rephrase? Can you say that one more time, Nikki? I'm sorry.
Do the mentioned issues make a federal or state government solution too difficult to affect communities or individuals?
I mean, I hope not. I hope not. I mean, I think that there are challenges to figuring out how to engage people at those levels of government. You know, there was a huge amount of organizational, you know, backlash and advocacy when, through the Farm Bill, the federal government was looking to, you know, when they do the Farm Bill, that includes the SNAP and the federal entitlement program. So a lot of organizations with a lot of support came forward to protest that. But, you know, working against the federal government or trying to work through that level of government is always going to be a challenge.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, James. I hope hopefully we've addressed your question. Any other questions before we wrap up? Or John, do you have any closing thoughts yourself?
Not particularly.
All right, well, thank you so much for sharing the results of the assessment. And again, you can find that link both on this page and in the chat. And also, if you visit www.appalachianfoodshedproject.org, you can have there's access to both this document and the Virginia assessment document. Sorry, go ahead, John.
Yeah, well, I guess the last thing I just say is that, you know, my email address is here. If folks have any other questions, please follow up with me directly. I really like talking about this work and this project. And in particular, in that community food security assessment, in that final document, or you can email me directly about it, you know, I have some of the tools, some of the data collection tools that we used if folks are interested in how we did the focus groups or what kind of questions we ask in the interviews, things like that. I'm happy to talk about that.
Thanks, John. And yes, he's a great resource for doing this sort of assessment, and we're very grateful for all the work he's put into this. So we do have one more webinar in this series on our community food assessments in the Appalachian Foodshed Project. Our next assessment presentation will be on May 4th at 2 p.m., and that will be on the West Virginia assessment. It will be with based on some of the work that has gone into the West Virginia Food Link website, if you had a chance to explore that. So if you aren't on our listserv, you can let me know and we can add you, or you can just visit our website, again, www.appalachianfoodshedproject.org, and click on the webinars link, and you can find both archived recordings of these webinars, as well as announcements and ways to connect to future webinars. So thank you so much, John, and thank you for participating in our webinar today.